Dámy a pánové,
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand up.
Vážený pane prezidente Pavle,
Dear President Pavel, dear President Clinton, I am honored to welcome you to the 11th edition of our conference, Our Security Cannot Be Taken for Granted, which is taking place symbolically on the 25th anniversary of the Czech Republic's accession to NATO. It is a great honor for us to welcome two commanders-in-chief, one current commander-in-chief and one former U.S. commander-in-chief, who had a very strong personal role in the expansion of the NATO. 5 years ago, we had the honor of welcoming Madeleine Albright here at the conference, who informed President Clinton that she was coming to Prague to attend this conference. And President Clinton gave her the message that Madeleine Albright read to all of us. This is the recording, and I'm going to quote, "Greetings to all of you who are here in Prague celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland joining NATO. As President of the USA, I've always tried to open the doors to the Central European nations, and the year 1999 was one of my proudest moments of my presidency. Today, it shows that it was the right thing to do, that it strengthened NATO and improved security in Europe and around the world, especially at the time when we see efforts to divide the world and retreat from humanity. Partnership in NATO is more important than ever." I can perhaps reveal that we also have Madeleine Albright's daughter, Kate, in the U.S. delegation here today. President Clinton, thank you for accepting the invitation to speak at our conference, and thank you for your political courage 30 years ago. Thanks to that, we were one of the first country, an opportunity to have a very prestigious position of chair of the NATO Military Committee, a position that was then taken by former chief of General Staff of the Czech Army and today's President, Petr Pavel, whom I would like to invite to the stage. The floor is yours.
Dear representatives of the parliamentary political parties, dear President Clinton, dear guests, to convince the public cannot be taken for granted is a bit easier for the third year in a row. Unfortunately, for reasons that are not too great. Last year, I mentioned how deeply we were wrong in the West when we thought that no conventional war was possible in Europe anymore. I talked about how collectively we overlooked all the warning signs. We wanted to believe in the strength of rules. We were convinced that business and economic cooperation will bring us together and will not make it possible for us to fight one another. The extent of Russia's and Putin's aggression and their brutality was a shock to us. It came as a shock, and the next year proved once and again that the war is now near to an end. The hopes that Ukrainians who took up the initiative will push out the occupants turned out to be wrong. Ukraine is coming on a defense. Ukrainians who know what the aggressor is capable of are trying to defend their country. They know that they are fighting for their survival and their own future. They want the same thing that we have always wanted to, the right to live in peace and to freely decide on their future fate. And through this prism, we should look at this year's anniversary. It was exactly 25 years ago that the Czech Republic became member of NATO. And our joining of NATO confirmed that we belong to the transatlantic family of nations. The subsequent peaceful years were easy. They gave us the feeling of security and it became something that most citizens consider for granted. But then the crisis and trials and tribulations came. We see that Russia never came to peace with its loss of influence. And without NATO commitments, perhaps we too, as well as our eastern neighbors, would have to face the same fate as Ukraine. The fate of Ukraine reminds us of how crucial it was that the political representatives back then took up the opportunity and helped us join NATO. Although it was not for granted too. It had its adversaries both abroad as well as here on the domestic political scene. 30 years ago, the question whether NATO should be enlarged and accept Eastern European states was a question of political debates in the US. The discussions why, if, and to what extent the Central Europe should be integrated into transatlantic structures was lengthy and difficult. And it has an open ending. It was an open question. And today, when we remind ourselves of our accession to NATO, we should be thankful to those who helped us become members of NATO and convinced others that we should be accepted. And that's why I invited Bill Clinton to Prague, the 42nd President of the United States of America and a great friend of the Czech Republic. President, once again, welcome to Prague. Thank you for your energy, for your openness and your optimism. Today, it's been 25 years since we've been members of NATO, and thanks to you and your administration, especially the Czech native and a great friend of Václav Havel, Madeleine Albright. I am honored I was honored to give you the Order of Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, and I am convinced that the first enlargement of NATO remains a great success today. NATO, thanks to the enlargement, received new capabilities as well as depth. New members contributed to the alliance and the security of all members, including the US. In between, we proved that we were able to be good and reliable allies, especially in military missions. It is worth mentioning that attractiveness of NATO is still relevant. There are still countries who are interested in joining, including Ukraine and Georgia. Out of 19 members in 1999, the number increased all the way to 32 this year. The accession of Finland and now Sweden means a material strengthening for NATO. But still, NATO faces two big challenges today. I've already mentioned the external threat, but there's also an unprecedented threat to the transatlantic unity. And that's why we need to know that NATO will remain our security guarantee only if we all respect our commitments and our security guarantees. 30 years since the fall of the Iron Curtain, Europeans took the peaceful dividend. But the awakening, the wake-up call was quite harsh. But now we finally see what's at stake. Finally, the Europeans realize what's at stake, and I'm glad that the Czech Republic decided to reach the minimum of 2% GDP defense spending. I would like to remind you all that the situation will probably require for us to invest much more into our defense in the future. Europe needs to be able to contribute to its own security so that we can be a reliable partner to the US and can contribute significantly to our shared security. And that's why the European NATO pillar needs to have strategic enablers developed, such as strategic transport, logistics, connections, including satellite connections, as well as strategic intelligence. The July Washington NATO summit will be an opportunity to show our US ally as well as the world that we stand ready to make our partnership a balanced one across both sides of the Atlantic. NATO as a whole, after years, is coming back to its primary legacy and role, which is shared collective security. We have to focus on our capacities to be able to win in the current conflict, but we also have to have a quantitative edge, especially in the modern technologies. There are three important tasks ahead of us. Increase industrial production in all sectors of defense industry. Second of all, increase our battle capabilities and or combat capabilities while using innovation and experience from the Ukrainian battlefield, especially in the area of autonomous systems, and keep internal unity of NATO. And of course, the Kremlin is aware of this condition, and that's why it's trying to wage hybrid warfare against European countries. We shouldn't forget that cyberspace has become the new operational domain of Russians. And that's why I would like to appreciate that we keep increasing our cybersecurity and information security as well. The trigger for Article 5 activation could be also a hybrid warfare or cyber attack that would be comparable to the effects of a conventional attack. I'm glad that the Czech Republic this year will host several important events which will address these roles in greater detail. In May, we will have a meeting of Ministers of Foreign Affairs, and in September, we will have the military committee meeting here in Prague. Dear guests, our security really cannot be taken for granted. Our interest in security, and to a worse extent also in defense, not only our and security, as well as the security of and defense of our allies, should be a question that is that goes beyond different or across political lines. It has nothing to do with political partisanship. Security is the main precondition for everything that free and democratic society has to offer. We need to have inclusive rule of law, economy, culture, as well as opportunities for every individual. Thank you for your attention and have an inspirational debate.
Dámy a pánové,
Ladies and gentlemen,
it's a great honor for me to introduce to you our keynote speaker today and also our main guest in Prague today. As we all know, 25 years ago, Czech Republic, together with Poland and Hungary, has formally joined NATO at the event at Truman's Library in Missouri. As the ambassador of my country to the United States, I had the privilege to be there too. My country thus got the best security guarantee in its modern history. And there were three extraordinary persons, 2 men and 1 woman, who helped to pave the road towards the fulfilling our long-time security goal. 2 of them are not more among us. They are just watching us from the heavens. Madeleine Albright and of course, President Václav Havel. But the third of them, and I would say the most important one, is still here, in a very good shape. We love you in Reduta, because you, President Clinton, made the most important decision. You invited us. You showed the courage, because we all remember that you had to convince many doubtful minds, even in your own administration. You expressed and did it with the wisdom and determination. There is a common wisdom in abroad that the Czechs are very effective in fulfilling their goals, and they are not very great in their ability to express the word of thanks. President Pavel, thank you very much for extending this invitation today, for awarding President Clinton just an hour ago, because I believe that this day is an opportunity to show to ourselves, as well as to the world outside, that the Czech are able to say thank you very much. So, dámy a pánové, ladies and gentlemen, welcome, give a warm welcome to President William Jefferson Clinton.
Whoa. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I thank you very much, Ambassador Vondra, for the memories, for your generosity. You managed to make me think about all this as if it happened yesterday. I miss President Havel, and I miss Madeleine Albright. But I'm glad that after 25 years at least, I was still standing and able to come and speak for, I hope, for them and for all of us who were here. I want to thank Lord George Robertson, former NATO Secretary General, for being here. He was there. Ambassador Sabat, thank you very much. And to Mr. Pavlicek and others involved in sponsoring this, I thank you. And mostly, President Pavel, I want to thank you for many things, but I would like to begin at least at part of the end of this story. When I became president, I wanted to expand NATO, but I knew that even some of the NATO members were questioning it. They were very proud of the military alliance and what it had done to stabilize Europe at the end of the war. And they were uncertain of whether the expansion would be more politics than security. What did it mean? Where would we stop? you know, all the things that keep people from doing things they should do in many areas of life. And Václav Havel was a remarkable man who had a good sense of humor and was not particularly overbearing. And Mr. President, I say this with great admiration, no one would ever make the mistake of thinking that he had been the head of his country's armed forces before he became president. He was a poet, a playwright, with an amazing imagination. But he was adamant about one thing from the first time I met him until I went with Madeline to your beautiful cathedral to his funeral. And that was that the Czech Republic would never be totally secure unless it was in a network of European security anchored by NATO. And I watched him make arguments for years before we finally worked all this out. But I remember 25 years ago, and I remember earlier than that when we voted to expand. We were 25 years ago, 27 years ago, I think, we were in Madrid voting to do this. And it's funny what you remember, since men often don't wear ties anymore, but I'm glad that all of you still do. I still remember that we were in Madrid and that perhaps their most famous manufacturer of ties, Loa, made a tie for all the people who had come to the NATO summit to vote to expand NATO. And on the tie, there was a depiction of a very famous Spanish game, which, at the time, which involved throwing real live human beings up and down out of a blanket. And we could see all these, and you know, so you might have an orange or a blue or a whatever figure, but they were all, I still got that tie. I looked at it again before I came on this trip. And sometimes you just have to take a chance. And that's what everybody involved 25 years ago decided to do. I think that it's been a good investment. It was a good, sensible risk, and it has immensely strengthened NATO. And the motto of this conference is as true today as it was then, perhaps more true. You can't ever take your security for granted. And we know that we need more networks of cooperation. For the benefit of those who are not Czech, who are here, and anybody who may be covering this, I do think, you know, we have a few people in America, I'm embarrassed to say, who like to appear as if somehow they think NATO's a con game and the United States is giving too much and nobody else is giving enough. It's ludicrous, that position. This is something that is helping us all, and no one today has been more visible. But I want this, since we're here and the Czech government is hosting us, what have you done with your 25 years? Prime Minister Fiala was among the first Western leaders to visit Ukraine. after the invasion of 2022. And you, Mr. President, last year became the first to visit the Eastern Front. Over the last 2 years, this country of only 11 million people has delivered more than $2.3 billion worth of military assistance to Ukraine. You were the first NATO member to give the Ukrainians heavy armored vehicles. And now you're leading the drive. I love this. I'm going to have a field day with this when I get home to America, and I'm lobbying the Congress to do our part. You are trying to figure out how to get 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine in a global collection effort that goes far beyond NATO members. Nobody else is doing that I'm aware of. So the most important thing I can say is thank you. Furthermore, I live in a country with 340 million people, and we have trouble managing our immigration problems on the southern border, as all of you know. 1.9 million people had to be processed last year. The Czech Republic has 11 million people. You do the math. And it's taken more than 500,000 refugees from Ukraine to try to show solidarity with freedom and decency and democracy. This NATO deal has been the best thing that ever happened to all the rest of us because of what the Czech Republic and Poland, and sometimes more reluctantly, but eventually there, and Hungary, have done with it. We did the right thing to expand NATO and to keep expanding it, and now there are more than 30 countries in NATO. So this is a day to celebrate our forebears, say they did a good job. It is also perhaps a day to think about a little bit what lies ahead. But I do think all of you should be grateful, because I'm not sure we could have done this then if it had not been for Havel's leadership. Just because he was so dogged about it. When I was president, we had a few members of Congress who wanted the White House to do things. And they were impossible to live with until you finally did whatever it was they wanted. And so we set up in the White House what we called a Just Say Yes list. Somebody got on that list, you didn't waste any time. Whatever they wanted, you just went ahead and said yes, because you knew you were going to do it anyway, and you didn't want to be an old person by the time you finally got around to being able to do something else. That's the way Havel was about this. It was great. So we should celebrate that. But I think we also should support those who have made sure in these last 25 years that the expansion was handled in the proper way. Not too fast, not too slow, making sure people were ready to assume the military responsibilities. Your president knows a lot about that. It's one thing to talk about doing something, quite another to be able to do it, and to do it in the right way. And I'm very grateful again to you. And finally, I think we can celebrate the fact that Finland and Sweden have just become the 31st and 32nd members of NATO, and they are very capable of strengthening our military capacity, our defense capacity. And they make the strategic geography of Northern Europe look entirely different. So for all of you who supported that, I thank you. I just wanted to say one or two other things, because I know you have a lot of things to do on your conference. When we were doing all this, I was really lucky that Madeleine Albright was my UN ambassador, and that I appointed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General John Shalikashvili, who was born in Poland to a father from Georgia and a Polish mother, and was the first enlisted person ever to rise all the way through the ranks to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was really good for America's knowledge of geography, too. They had to learn how to say Shalikashvili and then realize where Georgia was, that it was not a place that grew peaches in the middle of America. It was a remarkable place fighting for its own freedom. And we had, as my Deputy Secretary of State, to Madeleine Strobe Talbot, who is also still with us today, who, when we were boys, when we were just 22 and living together in England, he had run the Moscow bureau of Time magazine and was selected by the representatives of Nikita Khrushchev to receive his memoirs and translate and edit them. So the other thing I was doing when I first found the Czech Republic, I was living in England, and I would get up every morning and make breakfast for my roommate, Strobe Talbot, and listen to Nikita Khrushchev's voice over the tape recorder. And anybody who was thinking about anything then would have wondered, will the Berlin Wall ever fall? Will the Warsaw Pact ever come to an end? Will freedom ever return? But there were a lot of people who were convinced that it would. And the interesting thing is how many people were ready to make the most of it when it did. Because that's really what we're celebrating here, isn't it? I mean, 25 years ago, you had to figure out what was the next big building block in what would happen after the Berlin Wall fell. And you did the right thing. And it's funny, sometimes I feel like I was just the guy who was along for the ride. I was lucky. I was in the right place at the right time more than once. But I remember 25 years ago as if it were yesterday. And I believed that if we did this right, it would be peace and prosperity for 25 years. And I believed that if Russia made a decision that I was always afraid they would, which is not to keep working together with us, but to try to reestablish in some way a dominant geographical position on the European continent. That whether we did NATO right then would determine what would happen when the crisis came. And I think we should all say, all of you today, you should think about how you feel about all this. And think about the next 25 years. I think President Putin made a mistake deciding President. I would have stayed forever if there were no term limits, or until the people defeated me at the polls. But it's better in a free society to extol the system, the values, the rule of law, instead of the dominance of any individual. We should all do our part, give it our best, and go on with our lives as best we can, grateful for the chance to serve. But I just ask you to think about all this now, because he probably won't like my saying this, but President Putin's not going to live forever any more than I am. The last I checked, that we all have an expiration date, we just don't necessarily know when it is. And our job is to leave our children and grandchildren a future better than we had. So I will say this, I do not regret a single minute I spent trying to bring Russia into partnership with the rest of us. And we all know I failed, don't we? But I don't regret it. I met with President Yeltsin 13 times. I met with President Putin when he was prime minister, and then president 5 times. We had a NATO-Russia founding act to have a partnership. We gave Russia a vote in NATO affairs early. We offered them the chance to participate, and how we managed the end of both the Bosnian campaign and the campaign in Kosovo. I don't regret any of it. And I failed. Or we did, in the sense that Russia took a different path. But it's important to get caught trying to do the right thing. So there will come another time in the next 25 years, I predict. Maybe I'll be long gone, but we'll have a chance to write a new history. And it'll be better because of the strength of the Czech Republic. It'll be better because you let Sweden and Finland into NATO. It'll be better because no one can claim you're operating from a position of weakness when you hold open the door of partnership. I will always regret that all those years, in the years that I was president, 8 years, I met with the leader of Russia only 3 times less than all Americans had between 1945 and 1992, just in those 8 years. So when I hear all this stuff about how we jam them with the expansion of NATO, that's a big fairy tale. But the people of this country and your neighbors in Poland and Hungary and everywhere else, they deserve the right to be free. We deserve the chance to see Europe democratic and united and at peace for the first time since nation states rose up on the European continent. And as my old friends used to say, it was not NATO moving east. It was the East knocking on NATO's door. So I ask you in this security conference, without obviously ignoring what the consequences are now, we have to stay with Ukraine as long as Ukraine is fighting. Every one of us do. And the people who act like it doesn't matter to America or any other country just need to go back and review the history of Europe from the 1930s to the current day and see if we don't have a common responsibility to our people and to the future. But you also should be thinking of a brighter day. Yes, we need to get everybody behind the Ukraine. I admire the way President Zelensky and his family and his administration have hung in there. But someday we will have other options. And we need conferences like this to think about, what do we want NATO and Europe to look like 25 years from now? What about 50 years from now? I think that my President Biden, and our country, our government has the right position on this. I hope we will be able to persuade the Congress to go along. I think we need to make sure people know more about how much stronger NATO is with Sweden and Finland in it, and what a complementary picture it makes. But the most important thing I want you to do is not be ashamed or embarrassed, even in the midst of this conflict in Ukraine, to imagine 25 years from now. It will help us to hold support for staying the course in Ukraine if people actually believe that it can be different than it is. I do. I'm sorry that when I was there, I couldn't persuade Mr. Putin to stay with where I think we were going with his predecessor. I did my best. But time and circumstance happens to everybody. You're gonna have another chance. So we gotta stay together, stay with Ukraine, get through it, make sure the world knows how much better NATO is now because of your new members and what's being done, and keep dreaming of a better tomorrow. Remember, Havel was a poet and a playwright, and he had an infectious sense of humor, which he kept even when he was in prison. And he is the only head of state that I ever had ask me when I was invited him to the White House for a state dinner. He said, I want you to get Lou Reed to perform at the state dinner. He was the only head of state who ever asked me for someone who was a rock and roll legend, to what everybody else wanted to hear a famous cellist, a famous violinist, see a great actor. Havel knew, as we say where I grew up, where the rubber met the road. Don't forget, NATO lives where the rubber meets the road. So be proud of what you've done, prove that it works, and start dreaming right now about what you hope will happen when this meeting is held 25 years from today. Thank you.
Mr. President, thank you so much and for so much more than just this inspiring speech. Dámy a pánové, vážení diváci, vážení hosté.
Ladies and gentlemen, now I have the pleasure of welcoming you to a very unique panel, unique in the Czech Republic, because the goal of the next panel is clear. If you want to find a consensus on top security issues that are ahead of all of us, then it's already a tradition of this conference that we have a political debate of all leaders that are represented, or leaders of the parties represented in the Parliament of the Czech Republic. Now I will ask all the representatives in an alphabetical order based on the name of their political party. So first I would like to ask Karel Havlíček, first Deputy Chairman of ANO, then Ivan Bartoš, Chairman of the Czech Pirates Party, and Deputy Prime Minister for Digitization and Minister of Regional Development, Jan Bartošek, first Deputy Chairman of Christian Democrats, Alexandra Vondra, Deputy Chairman of the Civic Democratic Party and Member of European Parliament, Radim Fiala, Deputy Chairman of SPD and Member of the Chamber of Deputies of the Parliament of the Czech Republic, Vít Rakušan, Chairman of STAN and of Mayors and Independents and Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of the Interior, Markéta Pekarová-Adamová, Chairwoman of Top 09 and Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies of the Parliament of the Czech Republic. Ladies and gentlemen, take your seats, and I'm glad that we will have both presidents during the first part of the debate, so President Pavel and President Clinton. The first part of this panel has the same form. Each representative of a political party will have 2 minutes to sum up their vision of the security strategy of the Czech Republic. And since our program and our agenda are quite busy, I would like to ask you to stay true to the schedule. And first, Mr. Karel Havlíček. President Clinton, President Pavel, I feel a bit nervous since I'm the first, and we have a lady here, so I would like to ask the lady whether she would like to go first so that I don't feel embarrassed. Okay, so Madam Speaker, thank you for being a gentleman, but I will keep the alphabetical order because we discuss security issues, and in the army, you know, order is of utmost importance. So let's stick to the alphabetical order. Okay, well, so let me start by saying, or starting with the most important thing, 25 years of our NATO membership. I can say it right away. It was the most important step in the independent Czech Republic history. In my view, it's even more important than our accession to EU. Our joining the EU was more of a decision to become member of an economically developed world, but being part of NATO is, in my opinion, a strategic decision to be part of a free democratic world and not hide alibistically behind the curtain of neutrality. And after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the importance of NATO has increased even more. And it became strengthened with Finland and Sweden joining NATO. And as President Clinton said, it's important to show unity and strength. And it was also important to mention the DCA that was signed between the Czech Republic and the US, and we also have to strengthen the European pillar. That's why we also supported the 2% GDP defense spending. And when our party was at the helm, we also strengthened the defense spending. We increased it from 0.9% to 1.4%. As I'm sure you know, we also promoted inclusion of refugees from Ukraine, also the training of Ukrainian soldiers and so on. But on the other hand, we also have to be critical if we think that something is not right. We also have to talk about the funds being used efficiently. It's important. It's not important to use to spend 2% of GDP on defense. It's important to use it wisely and effectively. And we think that at this point, it's not good to start talking about Ukraine joining NATO at this point, and we are against sending troops to Ukraine. And we agree with Jens Stoltenberg, who said on Monday that NATO is not part of the conflict. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Okay, now Ivan Bartoš.
Thank you very much, President. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk at this conference, also conference that is organized on the occasion of 25th anniversary of our accession to NATO. Putin's aggression actually highlights the importance of security and defense cooperation in the Euro-Atlantic space. And I welcome the expansion of NATO by 2 new members. But actually, any naiveness with respect to aggressivity of strong regime would not pay off. You know, when you look at the Russian TV, they say that they are picking up European cities that they are planning to bomb. We know from history where appeasement leads, and we cannot allow a similar practice to happen with respect to Ukraine. Unfortunately, it was a tragic wake-up call, but the basic foundation for our security is the collective defense. We also need to cooperate at the European level so that the European Union is able to develop its security and defense aspect, because a strong and secure EU means a stronger and secure NATO. And to conclude, 2 more things. The Czech government supports active role of the Czech Republic in defense activities, and conventional war is not the only threat for Europe, and that's why we need to also be able to fight hybrid threats, economic war, and cyber tools that are an integral part of this war, and I am happy to say that the government adopts necessary measures as we consider them an important threat. Mr. Bartošek, dear presidents, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, I see the future of the Czech Republic as an active member of NATO. The future needs to be closely linked to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We also need to support resilience of the Czech Republic. Unlike the equipment and material that you can procure, the willingness of the people to protect its country, this is something that you have to actively support, and you have to start early in young generation to support this willingness. It will not appear just on its own. We can do it by supporting domestic defense industry, and when you look into the international arena, it's the question of good quality supply chains. I believe that manufacture needs to go back to Europe, because in case of conflicts, we are under threat. If there is no manufacture in Europe or in the Czech Republic, we are weak and vulnerable. That's the question for our future. We need to invest into R&D with new technologies. When we have China on one hand side that massively invests into AI, quantum computers, we individual states are not able to compete with China, but we need to stand against it. And it's about cooperation, because technology advance is something that distinguished us from the rest of the world, because there was technology advancement in Europe. Also, our internal security is important, and Russia tries to break the unity using social media. We have to support the faith of our people and believe in our state and integrity. Mr. Vondra. Well, President Clinton has said it all from the international point of view, and Jan Bartošek said it all from the Czech perspective, and I would sign all of that. I would just add, all starts with diplomacy and foreign policy. So before we start fighting, there are negotiations. So we need to stick to the three pillars: Atlantic, European, and Central European pillars. Yes, sometimes there are some difficulties. Now we have some discrepancies with Slovakia and Hungary with respect to certain areas, but we need to keep communicating. We need to eliminate the European weakness. We want the US to find some agreement in certain issues. So we need to have these three strong legs and have them balanced. And then we need to do the homework. First of all, to spend enough money on defense. 2% is the minimum amount. I think that we will discuss also increase of these spendings. We also need to make sure that army is able to defend us. We also need to improve the resilience and will in the general public. We also need to have a good foundation of the domestic defense industry. We have managed to do a lot in the past years, and we are witnessing that while supporting Ukraine. And Europe also needs to be able to protect its borders. And last but not least, we have to continue with supporting Ukraine and what the Czech government does. I support them, and I think it's noted well also abroad. Thank you very much. Radim Fiala. Dear presidents, in the past, We've been part of larger structures, and it not always paid off. For example, in 1938, and then after World War II, I mean the brutal Soviet occupation. But sometimes we have to think about ourselves. We have to define our security interests, and the situation actually forces us to do it. And we are in a situation when the country is in a very weak position in terms of army. It's a destruction of one of the pillars of statehood. And it's a paradox that politicians and political parties during the political crisis that is escalating are talking about a war and possible involvement of the country in the war. Our country must strive for a peaceful dialogue and coming back of stability in Europe. In the past, the term restricted stability was used, and it could be a restricted or limited nuclear war. This is a scenario that is possible and is fatally dangerous for the Czech Republic. Peace has become an unwanted alternative for crisis solution, and strategic failure of Russia is considered to be the right solution. But this strategic defeat is not what we need. We need to freeze the war and talk about peace and negotiate about peace and include all of the parties. We need to also have enough courage to change the borders in parts of the Ukraine, the changes that the borders that were created by the Soviet Union.
Dear President Pavel, dear President Clinton, I must say I'm an ideologically blind person, and with regard to the previous speech, and I must say we have to promote and support Ukraine until the defeat of Russia. We have to stand behind Ukraine, and it's our commitment to do so. Sometimes we have to, make sacrifices. Sometimes we have to, give up of a bit of comfort and funding, but or money. But still, it pays off because Ukrainians pay with their lives on a daily basis. Their best men and young men are killed every day, and we have to realize that we fight a strong adversary, be it Russia or China, who do not know the difference between private and public interest, between private and economic and so on. These are people who know no rules. We have to be ready by investing into our security. And I'm glad that our government committed to the 2% GDP defense spending. But we also have to think about our internal security. As our Swedish partners say, it's about total security. We need to make sure we don't have any blind spots. We have to fight off any campaigns, hybrid warfare, and so on. We have to invest into our integrated rescue system, into education of our young people so that they are able to do crisis management and are able to react to various types of crises. 25 years ago, we joined NATO, and we expected to receive a sense of security and safety, and it all have been fulfilled. And I would like to thank everyone involved. But I must say that we did not expect one thing, and this was conventional war in Europe. But it still happened, and thank God for NATO, for having strong allies. And last but not least, Madam Markéta Pekarová-Adamová. Dear President, ladies and gentlemen, today we mark not only 25 years in joining NATO, but on Friday it will be 85th anniversary. And I'm glad that some did not look at Ukraine the way that Mr. Fiala did in his speech, because it's important to realize that in Ukraine the fight is also for our freedom. we stand ready to help. And if someone here in the Czech political scene says that we should not give precedence to Ukraine, to our people, I emphasize that we help Ukraine because of our people, not at their expense. It's important to emphasize this, because if we want to live in peace and security for the next 25 years, we have to start acting now. And it's not only about our defense spending, and I think it should be more than 2% GDP. I think the 2% GDP is a bare minimum, but it's also about how we talk about those who devoted their lives to serving in army, to serving this country. And I would like to emphasize how much we appreciate those of you who serve in army, those of you who are also in various missions. So please tell it to all your colleagues, both men and women, those who are willing to risk their lives in missions, because we as politicians very much appreciate them, and we as citizens are grateful to them. That's why we also have to give you good weapons, because it's not only a question of deterrence, but also about saving lives and protecting the lives of those who risk them in these conflicts. We also have to clearly name the risks and threats. It's not just Russia, it's also China, Iran, terrorism, and even some local players. We have to clearly name our threats and security risks, because security cannot be taken for granted. It is an absolute necessity for their lives that we have and want to have. Thank you.
Dámy a pánové, já si dle předem doladěného programu dovolím nyní do toho vstoupit.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to jump in because, as was mentioned by the moderator, this political panel is our family silver, so to say, and we are grateful that both presidents remained here. But of course, I'm sure you all understand that thanks to the very busy agenda and also president's return back to the US, we will have to say goodbye to them. But please do not leave this hall now. We will stand up to say goodbye to them, but then our program will continue.
Dámy a pánové, děkuji za aplaus, který doprovodil našeho dnešního.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the round of applause to say goodbye to our dear guest today. Now I would like to ask the panelists to answer a set of questions, let's say by using the signaling flags. Green is yes, red means no, yellow means abstention. And I would like to ask you to vote to make it clear what your position is to the audience. And we can then discuss the answers later on. The first question, has NATO enlargement strengthened the security of the Czech Republic? We can see clear yes, clear unanimity. Question number 2, should the Czech Republic stay a member of NATO in the future? Okay, it's more difficult now. Question 3, do you agree that the Czech Republic should have 2% GDP defense spending? Again, the same result as during the previous vote. Another question, Are you in favor of continued support, military support to Ukraine? Thank you. And the last question. We're talking about historical enlargement of NATO. Are you in favor of Ukraine becoming one day member of NATO? Thank you. Thank you. I think you've all seen how the panelists voted. And now we stand here to remind or to mark 25 years since we joined NATO, and on the 4th of April, NATO will mark its 75th anniversary. And if we look 25 years ahead of time, what should the alliance do in order to be successful in the face of the challenges to come? Well, I think it's important to continue the current trend. I think nobody unified us just like Putin did. It was thanks to Putin's aggression that we have 2 new members. And it's glad that we are able to use this unity and resolve, and we should continue this trend. It's very important for us to continue investing into our security, and the 2% should be a very minimum. And it should be not only so in the Czech Republic, but in all allied countries. So the 2% should be the floor, not the ceiling. It took us a long time to achieve. And but it was in peaceful time, and now we are in the times of war. That's why we should increase the spending. And we should continue with the enlargement. When you ask about enlargement and inclusion of Ukraine, I think here in Europe there is no country that would have more experience with war and with fighting. And that's why we should do everything in our power so that once the war is over and Ukraine prevails, which I hope it will, Ukraine can become another full-fledged member of NATO. Because now it is Ukraine that fights off the biggest threat in our continent. So Ukraine not only deserves it, but it's necessary for Ukraine to join NATO at some point. Of course, we should talk about the quality and modernization of equipment and of defense systems and so on. So I'm not the best person to discuss these things, but generally speaking, I think we should modernize to be able to react to all the problems and to all the threats and challenges ahead of us. And we should, of course, accept those who are willing to join. Minister Rakušan, what about your vision of the next 25 years? It's a political discussion, so I will start by a political appeal. So I think in all countries of NATO we should vote or elect statesmen who will not cast doubt on the position of NATO, so that NATO is combat and action ready, so that we can depend on a strong ally on the other side of the Atlantic, and so that more and more countries help or increase their defense spending. We have this unity now, and we all are aware about how politics can interfere in these efforts. Apart from that, I think that in Europe we should not be only those who look on the other side of the Atlantic, but we should also strengthen the European pillar of NATO. We should realize that Europe also has to contribute to NATO and its future. We have to bear this in mind also in our domestic political decision-making. We shouldn't be a black passenger who only relies on others helping it. We also have to contribute to our own security. And just like Markéta mentioned before, Another thing that I would like to mention, we should draw lessons from our naivete. Just like President Clinton mentioned before, we thought that some countries would be friendly, would be friends, would change, and will be best buddies. But it turns out that some historical facts still remain today. And we should be aware that the risk in the East, be it Russia or China, are not going anywhere. Now we can see that these risks have actually escalated recently, and it can be so in the future as well. So we should perhaps adapt our mindsets to these realities. Radim Fiala, how is your view the same or different from the previous speakers? I have a very brief reaction. I think that NATO should remain a defense pact, and it should protect its members. That's the main role of NATO, and I cannot really say much more. I think that in the next 25 years, nothing should change on that. Mr. Alexander Vondra. Well, we civic democrats call it alliance, not a pact. And I think it's in our best interest to make sure that during the next 25 years, the alliance will remain functional, strong, and united. But the following is needed for that. On the one hand, we have our homework. So we should not only consume security, but we should also produce security. Because otherwise, we will weaken the collective security if we don't contribute with our part. We have to have sufficient defense spending. We need to keep our army in the best condition, in the best state. We have to equip it with the best equipment and weapons, and we have to realize that defense is a matter that concerns us all. And there's also another side to this story, and that it has a lot to do with international politics, because it's not all in our hands. But we can contribute to it. We can contribute to strengthening the alliance, not weakening it.